Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Liam Rose. I'm an author, mentor, life coach, motivational speaker, evangelist, musician, and activist. In this podcast and audio, we're going to be sharing a message. I've been sharing the Spiritually Helping Other People podcast to inspire humanity to go through a spiritual change, to learn about Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and Buddha, to learn about the no self and selflessness, and to learn about helping other people, giving back, and making a difference. Now, in this podcast and in this audio, we're going to be sharing a message called Overcoming the Self, Becoming the No Self. Now, it's so important to overcome the self in life. The self is where suffering, pain, and adversity and sin is, right? We all live a life that's focused on ourselves, what we do, what we achieve, our family, our friends, ourselves, our problems, our challenges, our circumstances, our hardships, our disappointments. So it's so important to overcome the self and becoming the no self. Now the self is where all the problems in life starts from. Each human being has a self. When we live for the self, we're living in suffering, pain, and adversity because no human being can consciously live righteously, truthfully, and faithfully, right? So the self is where the suffering, pain, and adversity comes from. You'll take decisions in life that will make you go through suffering, pain, and adversity. You'll make choices that will make you go through suffering, pain, and adversity. You will do things within your life that will cause you suffering, pain, and adversity. So the suffering, pain, and adversity will always come from the self. So the self is where the problem is, which I normally call the self is the problem. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we overcome the self and basically change to the no self and becoming the no self? Now this takes a spiritual change. So how do you go through a spiritual change? You go through this spiritual change within the 5 spiritual practices: prayer, meditation, mindfulness, walking, journaling. When you do the 5 spiritual practices every single day, when you have the opportunity to do it, then your mind will start to slowly change. When your mind starts to slowly change, we normally call this the renewing of the mind, the change in the psyche, and the change in the psychological mind. When your mind changes from the self to the no self, that's a spiritual transcendent transformation of your life, which is a spiritual transformation and a spiritual awakening. Now it's so important that we overcome the self and discover the no self and selflessness. This is what life is basically all about. If we don't overcome the self, we'll always live in suffering, pain, and adversities for all of our lives. We'll never be free. We'll always be in sin. We'll always be in corruption, deceit, destruction, pain, suffering, and adversity. So the self is where the problems are in life. So the self will have to change. Now, to becoming the no self, is very important. When we become the no self, we're basically living a life of service towards others, helping other people, helping the animals, helping the universe. So this is the no self life. The no self life, there's no more you. You know yourself, and you transcend yourself from the self into the no self. So the transcendence is very important. Not all human beings get the opportunity to transcend from the self to the no self because they constantly live for the self, the suffering, pain, and adversity, and the challenges. And it's okay to live in the self when you've gone through a lot of trauma, challenges, suffering, pain, and adversity within your life, because that's what happens to most people. But if we want to get to the point of spiritually changing our lives and transcending the self to the no self and overcoming the self, becoming the no self, we need to basically go through a spiritual change within the psyche and the psychological mind. Once your psyche and your psychological mind changes, then you do the 5 levels of helping other people. Level 1, volunteering. Level 2, jobs, careers, employment. Level 3, business, entrepreneurship. Level 4, faith and spiritual. Level 5, spiritually helping other people who helping other people. Now these are the most important levels in helping other people, which you can only get to once you transcended the self to the no self. Now, each human being has the opportunity to change, right? Change becomes the most important thing in life, and I'll repeat that again. Each human being has the opportunity to change. You can change your life for the better and change your life to basically help other people, help humanity, help the animals, help the universe. But you need to go for a spiritual change within the psyche and the psychological mind. If your psyche and your psychological mind doesn't change, it means you haven't gone for a spiritual change yet. It doesn't mean you're not going to, it just means right now within your life it's still focused on the self, the suffering, pain, adversity, and the sin. So this is what needs to change. This is what spiritual teachers and spiritual philosophers have been trying to show us, and Jesus Christ, Jehovah, and Buddha wants us to go for a spiritual change, a change within the psyche and the psychological mind. If we change within the psyche and the psychological mind, our whole life changes, because when we change our thinking, we change our life. I repeat that again, when we change our thinking, we change our life. So the spiritual change within the psyche and the psychological mind has to change. Each human being needs to go through a spiritual change, and that spiritual change transforms your life from the self to the no self. So this is the way of how we can overcome the self and become the no self, right? So this is basically the process of spiritual transformation, spiritual awakening. So I encourage the listeners and the viewers who are checking out this podcast and audio, go for a spiritual change. If you go for a spiritual change, your psyche and your psychological mind changes. By going for a spiritual change, you'll learn more about yourself, you'll know thyself, and you'll get to the point of no self and selflessness, which is a life of contributions and helping other people, helping the animals, helping the universe. So I hope this has helped. I hope you go for a spiritual change, and thank you for listening now. Take care. Bye bye.